I saved a black market werewolf, and now she won't leave my side. Have you ever wondered if the person designed to kill you is the only one who can save your life? It is a question that most people in the Galanthia sector never have to answer. But as the hull of Void Station Delta groaned under the pressure of a pirate boarding party, it was the only thought in my mind. On Void Station Delta, a life is worth exactly 40 credits, which is the price of a standard atmospheric filter. The corporate lords who built this rusted bucket did not care about the technicians who kept the lights on, and they certainly did not care about the things they kept locked in the basement. The technician did not look like a hero, but when the siren screamed and the hull buckled, he did not run for the escape pods. I stood my ground because a job half done is a death sentence for everyone else on the station, and I have always been a man who finishes what he starts. Real power is not found in a blaster or a fleet, but in the moment a man decides to stop being afraid of a monster. It is found in the steady hand that holds a wrench when the world is ending, and the quiet voice that speaks to a creature that everyone else has already given up on. My hands were shaking as I held the heavy wrench, not because of the pirates, but because I saw a girl where everyone else saw a weapon. I saw the pain in her dual-colored eyes, and I knew that if I did not act, the most beautiful thing in this sector would be snuffed out by the cold vacuum of space. Vance adjusted his glasses and wiped a thick grease stain from his cheek. The metal floor beneath his boots vibrated as another boarding pod slammed into the outer ring of the station. Red emergency lights bathed the corridor in a rhythmic, bloody glow. He ignored the screaming of the station-wide intercom and focused on the sparking junction box in front of him. "Vance, get out of there now," Hollis barked over the comms. His voice was strained, competing with the roar of engines in the background. "The pirates have breached Deck 4. They are venting the atmosphere in the lower levels to clear the security teams. You are going to be trapped." "I am almost done, Hollis," Vance replied, his voice remarkably steady. "If I do not bridge this connection, the containment fields in the high-security wing will fail. Do you have any idea what they keep in there?" "I do not care what the corporation is hiding," Hollis shouted. "I am at the docking bay with Marnie. We have the ship fueled and the engines hot. If you are not here in 5 minutes, we are leaving without you. I mean it, Vance." Vance did not answer. He shoved a copper wire into a terminal and watched the sparks fly. His glasses reflected the blue discharge. He was not a soldier, and he was not a pilot. He was a man who understood how things fit together. He knew that if the power failed here, the doors to the experimental wing would lock forever, or worse, they would fail and vent the subjects into the void. He finished the repair and tucked his wrench into his tool belt. Instead of heading toward the docking bay, he turned toward the heavy, scorched door of Containment Unit 709. The air here was thick with the smell of scorched insulation and spent propellant. The pirates had already passed through this hallway, leaving behind a trail of destruction, but they had missed the most important door. Vance pried the manual release lever. It resisted at first, the metal screaming against metal, but he put his weight into it. The door slid open with a hiss of escaping pressure. Inside, the room was small and sterile, illuminated only by the failing emergency lights of a single computer console. In the center of the room, a girl sat on the floor. She was not human, or at least not entirely. Toned muscles shifted beneath a dark bodysuit, and cybernetic armor fragments were fused to her shoulders and spine. When she looked up, Vance froze. Her eyes were striking. One was a deep, piercing blue, while the other was a brilliant gold. Sharp fangs peeked out from her upper lip as she let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated in Vance's chest. She was a werewolf, a product of the black market bioengineering that the Galanthia sector officially banned but secretly thrived on. "Stay back," she rasped. Her voice sounded like grinding stones unused to speech. "I am not here to hurt you," Vance said. He held up his hands, showing his palms. "My name is Vance. I am a technician." She flinched as a fragment of her cybernetic armor sparked against her skin, sending a jolt of electricity through her frame. She was held to the floor by heavy magnetic shackles that glowed with a dull, menacing purple light. "They are coming to kill everything on this station," Vance said, stepping closer despite the way she bared her teeth. "I can get those off you." "Why?" she asked, her dual-colored eyes searching his face. "You are just a human, you should be running." Vance looked at the shackles, then back at her. "I do not like seeing things broken when they should be free. Now hold still. This is going to be loud." He pulled the heavy wrench from his belt. It was a massive piece of industrial equipment, weighted for heavy-duty repairs. He didn't use a key or a code. He didn't have time for the finesse of a computer hack. He swung the wrench with practiced precision, hitting the primary release housing of the magnetic shackles. The metal groaned. He swung again, and this time the purple light flickered and died. The magnetic seal broke with a sharp clack. The girl pulled her wrists free, rubbing the raw skin where the metal had bitten into her. She stood up, and Vance realized she was nearly as tall as he was. Her presence filled the small room, a mixture of primal power and technological nightmare. She leaned forward, her nose twitching as she caught his scent. "You do not smell like the others," she whispered. "You smell like oil and old paper. You are not afraid of me." "I have work to do," Vance said, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "Being afraid would just slow me down. Can you run?" A massive explosion rocked the station, throwing them both against the wall. The ceiling above the corridor began to groan, the structural supports buckling under the weight of the deck above. "I can run," she said. "Then follow me," Vance replied. He offered her his hand. She stared at his palm for a long second. It was a small gesture, a simple offer of alliance, but in the cold, dark halls of Void Station Delta it was everything. She reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and warm. In that moment something shifted. The growl in her throat died down, replaced by a look of intense focus. She moved closer to him, her shoulder almost brushing his. The ceiling in the corridor collapsed just as they cleared the doorway. Dust and debris filled the air, but Vance didn't stop. He knew every maintenance shaft and every cooling duct in this sector. He led her through the haze, his hand never letting go of hers. "Vance, we are at the hatch," Holly screamed over the comms. "The pirates are on the landing pad. Where are you?" "We are coming," Vance said, his voice echoing in the narrow shaft. "And I am bringing someone with me." "You better be bringing a crate of gold for the trouble you are causing," Holly's grumbled, but the comms stayed open. "Romy," the girl said as they scrambled through a narrow vent. "My name is Romy." "Nice to meet you, Romy," Vance said. "Now let's get off this station before it becomes our tomb." They emerged into the secondary maintenance hall, the docking bay finally in sight. Romy stayed inches away from Vance's side, her eyes scanning the shadows for threats. She did not look like a prisoner anymore. She looked like a guardian. Vance felt a strange sense of warmth despite the chaos. He had spent his life fixing machines, but as he looked at the girl running beside him, he realized that some things were worth more than all the technology in the galaxy. They reached the final bulkhead, the ship's ramp visible in the distance, and Vance knew that their journey was only just beginning. The gravity in the maintenance shaft flickered, then died entirely. Vance felt his boots leave the floor, but he didn't panic. He had spent 10 years working the guts of stations like Delta, and he knew how to move in the drift. He reached out, his hand finding a recessed handle in the bulkhead, and he used his momentum to swing around, catching Romy before she could drift into the jagged edges of a broken ventilation fan. "Hold on to my belt," Vance said, his voice steady despite the groan of twisting metal echoing through the walls. Romy did as she was told. Her fingers, tipped with blunt but powerful nails, locked onto the heavy leather of his tool belt. She was shivering, a low tremor that Vance could feel through his own clothes. She looked at the spinning fan blades they had just avoided, her dual-colored eyes wide with a mixture of predatory focus and raw terror. She was a weapon of war, bioengineered for a purpose he couldn't yet fathom. But in this moment, she was just a girl who didn't want to die in the dark. Vance pulled a small bypass kit from his pocket. He jammed a data spike into the emergency port of the airlock at the end of the shaft. The station was screaming now, a series of muffled explosions vibrating through the chassis. He didn't need a sensor to know the atmosphere was venting 3 levels down. "Come on, you piece of junk," Vance muttered. He wasn't talking to Romy. He was talking to the door. He bypassed the security encryption with a series of rapid keystrokes on his wrist pad. He didn't need the station's permission to leave. He knew its architecture better than the architects did. The airlock hissed open, and the sudden return of artificial gravity slammed them back onto the deck plating. Vance landed on his feet, cushioning Romy's fall with his arm. They were in the secondary docking bay, a cavernous space filled with the smell of scorched coolant and spent fuel. At the far end, the Peregrine sat with its engines glowing a soft, expectant blue. Holly stood at the base of the ramp, his hand resting on the grip of a pulse carbine. He was a man built like a cargo hauler, with a face mapped by scars and a permanent scowl. When he saw Vance, his expression shifted from relief to pure confusion. "Vance, what in the stars is that?" Holly shouted, gesturing toward Romy. "She is with me," Vance replied. He didn't stop moving, guiding Romy toward the ship. Holly stepped forward, his eyes tracking the way Romy moved, her predatory grace obvious even in her exhausted state. "She looks like a lab project, Vance. We are already running from pirates. We do not need a corporate bounty on our heads." "She stays," Vance said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Holly's pause. Vance was usually the one to compromise, the one who smoothed things over with logic and technical data. Seeing him stand his ground with such heat was new. Romy reacted to the tension. She stepped in front of Vance, her upper lip curling to reveal teeth that were slightly too sharp to be human. A low, guttural sound vibrated in her chest. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a shield. "Easy, Romy," Vance said, placing a hand on her shoulder. He felt the muscles there, hard as coiled cables. "She is a friend. Holly's is a friend." Romy didn't stop growling, but she didn't move toward the pilot. She kept her eyes locked on Holly's, her body tense and ready to spring. Marnie appeared at the top of the ramp, her medical kit already slung over her shoulder. She took one look at Romy and whistled. "That is not a standard modification. Look at those subdermal plates. Holly's, quit being a doorstop and get us out of here. The station's orbit is decaying." Holly's grunted and turned back toward the cockpit. "Fine, but if she eats the upholstery, it is coming out of your cut, Vance." They scrambled up the ramp just as a massive explosion rocked the bay. The Peregrine shook, its stabilizers fighting to keep the ship level. Vance led Romy into the small common area and forced her into a padded seat. "Stay here," Vance told her. "You are safe now." Romy looked around the cabin, her eyes darting from the flickering monitors to the metal deck. She seemed overwhelmed by the sensory input of a functional ship. She reached out and touched the sleeve of Vance's jumpsuit, her grip desperate. "Do not leave," she whispered. It was the first time he had heard her speak clearly, and the sound sent a jolt through him. Her voice was melodic but carried a strange, metallic resonance. "I have to help Holly's with the launch," Vance said. He reached down and unzipped his heavy industrial jacket, pulling it off and draping it over her shoulders. It was too big for her, the thick fabric smelling of grease and recycled air, but she pulled it tight around herself. She buried her face in the collar, inhaling his scent, and the growling finally stopped. "I will be right back," Vance promised. He ran to the cockpit and dropped into the co-pilot's chair. Holly's was already working the thruster controls, his fingers flying across the console. "The docking clamps are fused," Holly said. "The pirate fire must have melted the release gears. We are stuck to a dying station, Vance." Vance didn't hesitate. He pulled up the ship's external diagnostic and routed power to the forward mining lasers. "We are not stuck. We are just attached. I am going to overcharge the emitters. On my mark, you give it full reverse thrust. You will blow the nose off the ship, Hollis warned. Trust me, Vance said. I know the melting point of those clamps. He watched the heat signatures on his screen, waiting for the precise millisecond where the metal would go brittle. Now Hollis hit it. The Peregrine roared. The ship vibrated so violently that Vance's teeth rattled in his skull. There was a sickening screech of metal on metal, and then a sudden, jarring release. They shot backward, clear of the docking bay, just as the entire section of Void Station Delta collapsed into a fireball. Hollis banked the ship hard, weaving through a field of debris that used to be a thriving trade hub. Behind them, the station broke apart, pieces of it catching the light of the distant star as they tumbled into the atmosphere of the gas giant below. We are clear, Hollis breathed, wiping sweat from his forehead, setting coordinates for Kalo 4. It is a long jump. We should have some breathing room. Vance stood up, his legs feeling heavy now that the adrenaline was fading. He walked back to the common area. Marnie was standing a few feet away from Romy, holding a handheld scanner. Romy was hunched in the chair, the oversized jacket still wrapped around her, watching Marnie with narrowed eyes. She has a fever, Marnie said, looking at the readout, and those cybernetic fragments in her skin are emitting a low-level frequency. It is not just armor, Vance. It is integrated into her nervous system. She is in pain. Vance approached slowly. He knelt in front of Romy, looking at the way the metal shards glittered against her skin. He saw the marks of the shackles he had broken, the raw skin where the magnets had chafed her wrists. Can you fix it? Vance asked. Marnie shook her head. Not out here. I can give her something for the pain, but that tech is proprietary. I have never seen anything like it. It is like someone tried to turn a wolf into a computer. Romy reached out and took Vance's hand. Her palm was hot, her skin pulsing with a rhythmic vibration. She looked at him, and for the first time the predatory gold in her eyes seemed to soften, leaving only the blue of a frightened child. You saved me, she said. Vance squeezed her hand, his heart heavy with a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. He was a man who fixed things, a man who understood the logic of gears and circuits. But as he looked at Romy, he realized that she wasn't a machine to be repaired. She was a person who had been broken by people who only saw her as a tool. I am not done yet, Vance said. We are going to get those things out of you, I promise. Romy leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. The ship jumped into warp, the stars outside the viewport stretching into long ribbons of white light. For the first time in years, Vance didn't think about the station or the credits he had lost. He thought about the girl in his jacket and the long road ahead. They were safe, for now, and in the quiet of the speeding ship, that was enough. Marnie tapped the glass of the diagnostic display, her brow furrowed as a jagged red line spiked across the holographic interface. The medical bay of the Peregrine was cramped, smelling of antiseptic and the sharp scent of cooling metal. Romy sat on the edge of the examination table, her fingers digging into the synthetic leather padding. The oversized industrial jacket Vance had given her hung off her shoulders, making her look smaller and more fragile than she had in the chaos of the station. I can see the hardware, Marnie said, her voice dropping to a whisper. It is buried deep in the suboccipital layer, Vance. It is not just a neural mesh for motor enhancement. It is broadcasting. Vance stood behind Romy, his hand resting cautiously on her shoulder. He felt the tremor running through her, a fine, high-frequency vibration that seemed to come from her very bones. He looked at the screen, his eyes scanning the data with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life reading machine code. It is a wideband burst, Vance said, pointing to the rhythmic pulse on the monitor. It is encrypted, Aegis Corporation signatures all over it. They are not just tracking her, they are pinging her. Romy let out a low, guttural sound that was half sob and half growl. Her eyes, one brilliant blue and the other a predatory gold, flickered toward the ceiling. It hurts, She whispered. "It feels like a needle pressing into the base of my skull every time the light flashes." Hollis leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed over his flight suit. He looked from the monitor to the girl and then to Vance. "If that thing is talking to the Aegis satellites, we are basically flying a giant flare through the dark. They do not even need long-range sensors to find us. They just have to listen for the shouting." Vance tightened his grip on Romy's shoulder, a gesture of grounding support. "How long until they triangulate our position?" Marnie pulled up a star map, overlaying the signal strength against their current trajectory toward Kalo 4. "At this rate, they will have a lock before we even hit the outer rim of the system. But that is not the worst part. Look at the timing of the bursts. They started the moment the pirate ships breached the station's perimeter." Vance felt a cold realization settle in his gut. The raid on Void Station Delta wasn't a random act of piracy. It was a controlled environment. They let the pirates in to see how she would react in a live-fire scenario. The whole thing was a performance. Romy turned her head, looking up at Vance with a raw, desperate intensity. "I am a dog to them," she said. "A dog they wanted to see bite." "You are not a dog," Vance said firmly. "You are the reason they are going to regret ever building that station." He walked over to his tool chest, which he had dragged into the med bay earlier. He flipped the latches, revealing rows of precision instruments, micro-welders and frequency jammers. He selected a pair of neurostatic tweezers and a fine-point thermal cutter. Marnie stepped back, her eyes wide. "Vance, you cannot be serious. That tech is fused to her spine. One slip and you bypass her central nervous system entirely." "I have spent 15 years repairing delicate avionics and pressurized fuel lines where a millimeter of error means an explosion," Vance said, his voice calm and steady. "I know how to handle high-stakes hardware. Marnie, I need you to monitor her vitals. If her heart rate spikes too high, tell me instantly. Hollis, get to the cockpit. We need a new heading. We are not going to Kalo 4. "Where are we going?" Hollis asked. "The Oros Nebula," Vance replied. "The gas clouds there are thick with ionized particles. It will buy us time by dampening the signal. While we are in the thick of it, I am going to cut that beacon out of her." Hollis nodded, recognizing the tactical logic. He disappeared toward the bridge, the deck plates vibrating as he pushed the engines to their limit. Vance pulled a stool over and sat behind Romy. He gently moved her hair aside, exposing the pale skin of her neck and the dark, metallic glint of the cybernetic fragments embedded there. The skin around the metal was red and inflamed, a constant reminder of the torture she had endured. "This is going to be difficult, Romy," Vance said. "I cannot use a general anesthetic because I need your nervous system to stay active so I can see which wires are live. You have to stay completely still. Can you do that for me?" Romy took a deep breath, her chest heaving. She reached back and found his free hand, squeezing it with enough force to bruise. "I trust you," she said. "Just make the noise stop." Vance began the work. The med bay fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft click of his tools and the steady beep of the heart monitor. He worked with a surgeon's focus, his hands never wavering. He could see the proprietary alloy of the Aegis beacon, a cruel piece of engineering designed to be permanent. It was hooked into her pain receptors, a fail-safe to keep her compliant. Every time the beacon pulsed, Romy's body jerked, and Vance had to pause, waiting for the surge to pass. He spoke to her in a low, rhythmic tone, telling her about the world he wanted to show her. He talked about the amber forests of Vespernine and the way the gravity felt light on the moons of Jora. He wasn't just distracting her. He was building a bridge of words to keep her from falling into the dark. "I see it," Vance muttered, his sweat dripping onto his goggles. "It is a secondary layer, a hidden transceiver buried under the primary plating." He used the thermal cutter to sever the microscopic filaments connecting the beacon to her vertebrae. It was slow, agonizing work. At one point, Romy's eyes rolled back, and a low moan escaped her lips, her fangs baring in an involuntary reflex. "Stay with me, Romy," Vance commanded, his voice a tether, almost there. With a final, precise snip, the red light on the diagnostic monitor went flat. The jagged spikes disappeared, replaced by a smooth, steady wave. Vance pulled the small, blood-stained piece of tech away with his tweezers and dropped it into a lead-lined containment jar. Romy slumped forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The tension that had defined her body since he found her seemed to evaporate. She turned around, her eyes searching his. The gold in her right eye was still there, but the predatory edge had vanished, replaced by a profound sense of relief. "It is gone," she whispered. "The shouting is gone." Vance wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, his muscles finally allowing themselves to ache. "We are not just hiding anymore, Romy. They think they can track us. They think they own you." He looked toward the bridge where Hollies was calling out their entry into the Oros Nebula. The ship rocked as it hit the dense gas clouds, the viewports filling with swirling purples and deep greens. "Marnie, clean her up and get her some protein rations," Vance said, standing up and grabbing the containment jar. "Hollies, change of plans. We are not just using the nebula for cover." "What are we doing then?" Hollies' voice came over the internal comms. Vance looked at the small, pulsing beacon in the jar. "We are going to feed this thing into a drone and launch it toward the gravity well of the nearest star. While they are busy chasing a ghost, we are going to double back." He looked at Romy, who was watching him with a new kind of intensity. It wasn't just the imprint of a survivor anymore. It was the look of a partner. "We are done running," Vance said. "If they want their asset back, they are going to have to come through me. And I have got a whole ship full of tools they have never seen before." Romy stood up, her movements fluid and strong. For the first time, she didn't look like a victim. She looked like a storm waiting to happen. She walked over to Vance and placed her hand over his on the containment jar. "Show me how to fight them," she said. Vance smiled, a hard, determined expression. "That is the easy part. First, we show them that you cannot put a leash on something they don't understand." The Peregrine dived deeper into the nebula, the hunter's signal fading into the static of the stars, leaving the crew in the quiet of their own making. For the first time since the escape, the air in the ship felt light, charged with the warmth of a bond forged in the fire of the unknown. They were no longer just refugees. They were an alliance. The gas giant Sarkhan loomed ahead, a massive sphere of swirling amber and deep violet clouds that seemed to swallow the light of the distant stars. Hollies gripped the flight controls of the Peregrine, his knuckles white against the dark plastic. Behind him, Marnie checked the power levels on the defensive shields for the third time in 10 minutes. They were sitting ducks by design, hanging just at the edge of the planet's gravity well, waiting for a ghost to appear. Vance sat on the deck of the cargo hold, surrounded by dismantled power cells and copper wiring. Romy crouched beside him, her dual-colored eyes scanning the dark corners of the ship. She looked different now than she had back on the station. The jagged edges of her fear had smoothed into a cold, focused readiness. She watched Vance's hands, fascinated by the way he manipulated the delicate internals of a mining detonator with the same care he might use to fix a clock. "Do you think they will send a whole fleet?" Romy asked. Her voice was low, devoid of the tremors that had defined her since the escape. Vance didn't look up from his work. He was busy soldering a connection on a small, boxy device. "They won't risk damaging the asset," he said. "They will send a single interceptor, high-speed and equipped for boarding. They want you back in one piece, Romy. They think I am just a mechanic who got lucky. They think they are coming for a rescue mission, not a fight." A sharp chime echoed through the ship. The voice of Hollies came over the internal comms, tight with tension. "We have a visual, Vance. Aegis Interceptor, identified as the Obsidian. They are coming in fast and they are not broadcasting a greeting." "Don't answer," Vance said, finally standing up and wiping his hands on a greasy rag. He tucked a small remote trigger into the pocket of his overalls and patted it. Everyone get to your positions. Romy, stay in the shadows until I give the signal. Remember what we talked about. Precision, not rage. The ship groaned as a massive shadow fell over the viewport. The Obsidian was a sleek, predatory vessel built for one purpose: reclamation. A bright flash of blue light erupted from its forward hull, and a second later, an ion pulse slammed into the Peregrine. The surge of static sent sparks flying from the secondary consoles. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the dim, pulsing red glow of the emergency backups. "They are docking," Marnie said, her voice steady despite the situation. "Port side, main airlock. They are using a hard seal clamp." Vance walked toward the airlock, his expression neutral. He looked like any other technician caught in a bad situation, his clothes stained with oil and his hair messy. He didn't carry a rifle or a blade. He only had his heavy tool belt and a calm that seemed to unsettle even Holly's as the pilot emerged from the cockpit with a pulse pistol. "Put that away, Holly's," Vance commanded. "If you fire that, they will vent the ship before we can breathe. Let me talk. We play this my way." The airlock hissed as the pressure equalized. The heavy steel doors slid open, revealing a squad of 4 armored corporate security officers. At their center stood a man in a crisp, dark uniform, his face a mask of bureaucratic indifference. This was Commander Vane, the man responsible for the Aegis Recovery Division. He stepped onto the Peregrine, his boots clicking on the metal grating. He ignored the flickering lights and the smell of scorched circuitry, his eyes locking onto Vance. "You have something that does not belong to you, technician," Vane said. His voice was smooth like oil over glass. "Where is the subject?" Vance leaned against a bulkhead, crossing his arms. He looked bored, as if he were discussing a late shipment of spare parts rather than a bioengineered girl. "You mean Romy," he said. "She is not a subject. She is a passenger, and your tracking beacon is currently drifting in the center of the Oros Nebula on the back of a space slug. I imagine your recovery team is having a very confusing afternoon." Vane's eyes narrowed, his composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "A clever trick," he admitted, "but you are out of tricks now. This ship is dead in the water. My men will find her, and when they do, your life becomes a liability we can no longer afford. Move aside." "I wouldn't be so sure about the tricks," Vance replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, battered handheld diagnostic tool. "I spent the last 3 hours rerouting the emergency power through the floor plating in this bay. I also took the liberty of modifying the ventilation scrubbers." Vane stepped forward, a sneer curling his lip. "You think a little shock is going to stop armored soldiers? You are a repairman, Vance, not a soldier." "It is not about the shock," Vance said. He clicked a button on the tool. The floor didn't spark. Instead, a series of small, improvised canisters he had hidden under the grating hissed loudly. A dense, metallic fog began to fill the room in seconds. The soldiers raised their weapons, but their targeting systems began to cycle wildly, the red lasers dancing across the walls without locking on. The metallic dust was a localized chaff cloud, designed to blind the very sensors their high-tech armor relied on. "Now," Vance whispered. From the shadows of the overhead rafters, a blur of motion descended. Romy didn't growl or scream. She moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency. She landed behind the first 2 guards, her movements fluid and precise. She didn't use her claws to kill. Instead, she used her enhanced strength to strike the joints of their armor, disabling their weapon arms and sweeping their legs with practiced ease. She was a shadow in the mist, appearing and disappearing before the soldiers could even turn their heads. Vane reached for a sidearm at his hip, but Vance was faster. He didn't use a gun. He swung his heavy industrial wrench with the practiced ease of a man who had spent a decade working on stubborn machinery. The heavy metal connected with the wrist of Vane, sending the pistol skittering across the floor. Vance followed up by grabbing the commander's shoulder and spinning him around, pinning him against the airlock frame. "Stay down, Commander," Vance said. Romy stood over the fallen guards, her dual-colored eyes glowing in the dim red light. She looked at Vance, waiting for the next cue. There was no feral madness in her gaze, only the sharp intelligence of a partner who trusted the plan. She had the power to tear the room apart, but she held back because Vance had asked her to. Vance grabbed Vane by the collar and pulled him toward the airlock control panel. "You are going to give the order for your ship to release the docking clamps," Vance said. "Or I am going to let my friend here show you exactly why you shouldn't have put those cybernetics in her spine. She has a lot of built-up frustration, and I am running out of reasons to tell her to be nice." Vane looked at Romy, then back at the unassuming technician holding him. "You are insane," he hissed. "Aegis will hunt you to the ends of the galaxy for this. You cannot hide forever." "Then we will have a very long trip," Vance said. "Dial it in, now." Vane hesitated, his eyes darting to his downed men who were struggling to stand in the heavy chaff cloud. Romy took a single step forward, the light catching the sharp edges of her teeth as she let out a low, vibrating breath. The commander's resolve broke. He reached for his comms unit, his hands shaking. "This is Vane," he said into the device. "Release the clamps, prepare for immediate detachment. The asset is compromised." As the magnetic locks disengaged with a heavy thud that vibrated through the entire hull, Vance shoved the commander back toward the airlock. "Hollies, get us out of here the second we are clear," he yelled. "Wait," Romy said, her voice sharp. She pointed toward the cargo bay entrance. One of the soldiers had regained consciousness and was reaching for a thermal detonator on his belt. Vance didn't panic. He reached into his tool belt and pulled out a small, powerful magnet, tossing it toward the soldier. The magnet didn't do much on its own, but it triggered the secondary pulse mines Vance had planted earlier. A sharp crack of blue energy rippled through the bay, short-circuiting the detonator and the soldier's armor simultaneously. The man slumped back, his systems fried. The engines of the Peregrine roared to life as Hollies bypassed the ion damage, using the jumpstart sequence Vance had rigged earlier. The ship lurched forward, pulling away from the obsidian just as the airlock sealed shut, leaving the corporate boarding party stranded on their own ship as it drifted. "We are clear," Hollies yelled from the front. "Engaging warp in 5 seconds. Hold on to something." Vance slumped against the wall, the adrenaline finally beginning to fade. Romy walked over to him, her breathing steady. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlaced with his. Her grip was firm but gentle, a far cry from the trembling girl he had found on the station. "You were captured for 3 seconds," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "Was that part of the plan, too?" "Calculated risk," Vance said, wiping a smudge of grease from his forehead. "I knew you wouldn't let him keep me. I had faith in my partner." Romy leaned her head against his shoulder, her hair brushing against his cheek. "I won't ever let them take you, Vance. You gave me a choice, and I chose this. I chose us." The stars outside the viewport stretched into long ribbons of light as the ship entered warp. They were safe, for now, and the bond between the technician and the girl who was no longer a subject had become something unbreakable. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were a team that had looked into the eyes of their hunters and refused to blink. Marnie walked into the bay, holding a medical scanner and looking over the unconscious guards they had left behind. "Everyone still in one piece?" she asked. "Better than that," Vance said, looking at Romy. "We are finally ahead of them. We are not just running anymore. We are winning." The warmth in the small cargo bay was a stark contrast to the cold void they had just escaped. They had fought their first battle as an alliance, and they had won on their own terms. As the ship hurtled toward the unknown reaches of the galaxy, Vance knew that no matter what Aegis sent next, they would be ready. He looked at the heavy wrench in his hand and then at the girl by his side. Tools and heart were a combination the corporation never saw coming, and it was the only thing that would keep them free. The Peregrine dropped out of warp with a shudder that vibrated through the deck plates, but the screaming of the alarms had finally ceased. Vance adjusted the settings on his console, watching the distorted blur of hyperspace resolve into the sharp, brilliant reality of a new system. Ahead of them lay Ethelgard, a world that appeared like a polished amethyst hanging in the velvet dark. It was a planet of vast lavender fields and crystalline mountains that caught the light of a single, golden sun. Hollis leaned back in the pilot's seat, his hands resting loosely on the controls. "We made it," he said, his voice carrying a rare note of genuine relief. "Aegis won't find us here. This sector is off the charts for anyone without the specific nav coordinates you pulled from Vane's ship." Vance nodded, his eyes fixed on the scanner. "The atmosphere is clean. No orbital platforms, no tracking arrays, just us." He stood up and made his way to the back of the bridge where Romy waited. She was sitting on a storage crate, her posture still coiled like a spring, but the feral intensity in her gaze had softened. She looked at Vance, her dual-colored eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the tension slowly drain from her muscles. "It is almost over, Romy," he said quietly. "Marnie is ready." The girl touched the jagged metal plating that still clung to her spine, the last remnants of the Aegis control system. "It does not hurt as much now," she whispered, "but I can still feel it trying to talk to the stars." Vance shook his head. "Not for long. We are going down to the surface. The air there is rich in minerals that will help you heal after the surgery. Marnie says the crystalline structures on the planet actually dampen low-frequency transmissions. Even if that beacon tries to restart, it will be muffled by the world itself." Marnie stepped into the bridge, carrying a tray of sterilized instruments and a localized anesthetic. "We need to do this while we are in stable orbit before we land," she said, her tone professional but warm. "I do not want any planetary dust interfering with the neural connections. Vance, I need you to assist. Your hands are the steadiest on this ship, and you know the architecture of those components better than I do." Vance took a deep breath and nodded. He led Romy toward the medbay, the small room smelling of antiseptic and recycled air. Romy lay down on the table, her eyes never leaving Vance. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I will be right here," he promised. The procedure took hours of grueling, meticulous work. Vance used a microlaser to sever the carbon fiber filaments that had burrowed into Romy's nervous system. Every time she winced, he felt a pang in his own chest, but he kept his focus. He was a technician, and this was the most important repair of his life. He wasn't just fixing a machine or a ship. He was reclaiming a soul from the hands of people who thought life could be owned. The last piece of Aegis technology, a silver hexagonal chip stained with blue-tinted blood, finally clicked free. Marnie dropped it into a containment jar, and the silence that followed was heavy with significance. "She is clear," Marnie whispered, wiping sweat from her brow. "The neural pathways are knitting back together on their own. Her biology is incredible." Vance stayed by Romy's side as she drifted into a deep, natural sleep. It was the first time he had seen her face completely relaxed, the lines of constant pain finally smoothed away. He stayed there until the ship entered the atmosphere of Ethelgard, the hull groaning as it met the air. Hollis brought the Peregrine down in a wide valley where the lavender grass grew tall enough to brush the underside of the landing gear. When the engines finally cycled down, the silence was absolute. Vance opened the main ramp, and the scent of the planet flooded the interior. It smelled of rain and crushed flowers, a sweetness that felt like a physical weight being lifted. Romy stirred on the medical bed. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. She looked at her hands, then at her reflection in the darkened monitor. The cybernetic glow that had always shimmered beneath her skin was gone. She looked human, save for the wild beauty of her eyes and the strength in her frame. She walked toward the ramp, her movements fluid and graceful. Vance followed her. When she reached the edge of the metal plating, she hesitated, her bare toes hovering over the purple grass. "Go on," Vance said, stepping up beside her. "It is yours, all of it." Romy stepped down, her feet sinking into the soft earth. She closed her eyes and took a long, shaking breath. "I can hear the wind," she said, "just the wind. No voices, no commands, no static. Vance walked down the ramp and stood next to her. He realized he was still holding his heavy industrial wrench in his belt loop, a habit from years of survival. He unhooked it and looked at the tool that had helped him break her chains. He didn't need it for that anymore. Hollis and Marnie joined them, standing a few paces back. The pilot crossed his arms, looking out at the crystalline peaks that glinted like diamonds in the sunset. "Not a bad place to disappear," Hollis remarked. "I think I could get used to a view that does not involve a bulkhead." Marnie nodded. "We have enough supplies to start a homestead, and the ship can stay hidden in the caves to the north. We are off the grid, Vance, truly." Vance looked at Romy. She turned to him, the golden light of the sun catching the blue and gold of her eyes. She didn't look like a subject or a weapon. She looked like a woman who had found her way home. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlocking with his. "You saved me," she said, her voice steady and full of warmth. "We saved each other," Vance replied. He knew the galaxy was still a dangerous place, and that Aegis might never stop looking for what they lost, but as he looked at the horizon, he felt a profound sense of peace. He was a man who fixed things, and for the first time he felt like the world was finally right. They walked together into the fields, leaving the cold metal of the ship behind. The lavender swayed around them, a sea of color under a sky that had never known the shadow of a corporate flag. Vance let go of his past as a lonely technician on a dying station, embracing the warmth of the hand in his and the promise of a life where they were finally free to define themselves. The journey had been long and the stars had been unkind, but here, on the soil of Ethelgard, the story of their survival ended and the story of their life began. The peace of the lavender fields lasted exactly 3 months. Vance had spent those days building a permanent structure near the crystalline cliffs, using salvaged plating from the peregrine and timber from the local ironwood trees. He liked the physical labor. It kept his hands busy, and his mind off the high-frequency alerts he still monitored on his wrist link. Romy spent her time exploring the heights, her strength returning in full as she shed the last of the corporate toxins from her system. She looked less like a weapon now, and more like a woman who had finally found her soul. The sky over Ethelgard bruised suddenly on a Tuesday afternoon. Vance was tightening a structural bolt on the porch when the sensor on his belt began to chirp a rhythmic, jagged warning. He didn't need to look at the screen to know what it was. The heat signatures entering the upper atmosphere were too large for meteors and too fast for research probes. Aegis had found them. "Hollis, get the engines hot," Vance said into his comms, his voice dropping into the calm, flat tone he used when a machine was failing. "Marnie, prep the medical bay. We have company." A mile away, Romy appeared at the edge of the lavender field. She ran with a fluid, terrifying grace that no human could match, her dual-colored eyes locked on the 3 streaks of fire descending from the clouds. She reached the cabin in seconds, her chest heaving but her hands steady as she grabbed the modified pulse rifle Vance had built for her. "They are not here for me this time," Romy said, her voice low and vibrating with a new kind of certainty. "They are here for the planet." Vance looked up at the crystalline mountains. The peaks were glowing with a faint, pale light, reacting to the massive electromagnetic displacement of the descending Aegis harvester ships. "Why the planet?" "The crystals," she replied, pointing toward the tallest spire. "They are the natural version of the processor in my head. Aegis did not invent the tech, Vance. They stole the blueprint from this world decades ago. Now they have come to strip the source." The first harvester hit the ground 2 miles to the north, the impact sending a tremor through the soil that knocked a row of Vance's tools off his workbench. 2 smaller escort ships banked over the valley, their underside turrets swiveling toward the peregrine. Vance grabbed his heavy industrial wrench and a satchel of improvised pulse mines. He didn't feel fear, only a cold, mechanical focus. "If they strip the mountains, the ecosystem dies," he said. We did not work this hard to find a home just to watch them turn it into a quarry. Holly's voice crackled through the comms. Vance, the Peregrine is pinned. Those escorts are painting us with target locks. If I lift off, they will blow us out of the sky before I clear the canopy. Hold position, Hollies, Vance commanded. Romy and I are going to the relay station on the ridge. If I can tap into the mountain's natural resonance, I can create a feedback loop that will fry their targeting sensors. It is a long climb, Vance, Romy warned, looking at the jagged path up the cliff. Then it is a good thing I have the fastest climber in the galaxy with me, he said, offering her a quick, tight smile. They moved through the lavender, staying low as the Aegis soldiers began to deploy from the harvester. The troops wore sleek, white environmental suits and carried heavy disruptors. They moved with the clinical precision of men who were paid to ignore the beauty of the worlds they destroyed. Vance watched them through a pair of digital binoculars, nodding the commander in the lead. It was a man he didn't recognize, but the Aegis insignia on his shoulder was enough. We need to reach the apex before they set up their stabilizers, Vance whispered. Once those stabilizers go online, they will anchor the tectonic plates and start the sonic fracturing. The whole valley will collapse. Romy didn't say a word. She simply reached out, grabbed Vance by the harness of his tool belt, and began to climb. She moved with impossible power, her fingers finding purchase in the crystalline cracks that would have baffled a human climber. Vance held on, his heart hammering against his ribs, but he trusted her completely. He focused on the technical schematic in his mind, calculating the exact frequency needed to turn the mountain into a giant tuning fork. They reached the ridge just as the first stabilizer began to hum. Vance winced at the sound, a grinding, metallic vibration that made his teeth ache. He scrambled to a small outcropping where a natural vein of pure quartz protruded from the rock. This was the nerve center of the mountain. "I need 3 minutes," Vance said, pulling a portable hacking deck from his satchel and slamming it into a crevice. "I have to bridge the gap between the ship's power cell and the mountain's mineral core." Romy stood at the edge of the ridge, her back to him. "I will give you 5, she said. The Aegis escort ships noticed them. One of the vessels peeled away from the Peregrine, its engines roaring as it ascended toward the ridge. A hatch slid open, and a squad of 4 jump troopers launched themselves toward the outcropping, their jetpacks trailing white smoke. Vance worked with a frantic, precise energy. He stripped the casing off his power cell, exposing the glowing core. He used his wrench to wedge a copper conductor between the cell and the mountain vein. Sparks showered his arms, stinging his skin, but he didn't flinch. He was a technician, and this was just a very large, very angry machine. The first trooper landed 10 feet from Vance, raising a disruptor rifle. Before the soldier could pull the trigger, a blur of gray and gold intercepted him. Romy hit the man with the force of a speeding vehicle, her claws shredding the pressurized suit. She didn't kill him, but she disabled his pack and tossed him off the ledge into a soft drift of lavender far below. The other 3 troopers landed in a semicircle, their boots clanking on the crystal. They fired, the red bolts of energy sizzling through the air. Romy moved like water, ducking and weaving, using the terrain to her advantage. She was a shadow in the bright light of the afternoon, a protector who had finally found something worth fighting for. "Vance now," she shouted, her voice strained as she blocked a strike from a vibro blade. Vance slammed the final connection home. The mountain didn't make a sound, but the air suddenly grew heavy with static. The hair on Vance's arm stood up, and a pale blue glow began to crawl up the crystalline spires. The Aegis escort ship above them suddenly bucked. Its navigation lights flickered wildly, and the engines began to cough out black smoke. The feedback loop was working. The mountain was pushing back, sending a massive surge of natural energy directly into the high-tech sensors of the invaders. Below them in the valley, the stabilizers groaned and shattered, their internal components melting under the invisible pressure. The harvester ship tilted dangerously, its landing struts buckling. Vance stood up, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the mountain. He looked at the Aegis troopers, who were now clutching their helmets as their internal comms fried. "You chose the wrong planet to harvest," he muttered. The escort ship lost power completely, drifting sideways before crashing into a rocky gorge well away from the cabin. The main harvester began a desperate, staggered ascent, its captain clearly realizing that the environment itself had become a weapon. Within minutes, the streaks of fire were pointing away from Ethelgard, retreating into the blackness of space. The silence that followed was heavy and sweet. The blue glow faded from the crystals, leaving the mountains looking like silent sentinels once more. Vance slumped against the rock, his hands shaking as the adrenaline began to recede. Romy walked over to him, her breathing slowing. She looked down at her hands, then at him. "They will be back," she said, but her voice wasn't afraid. "Let them come," Vance replied, wiping a smear of grease and soot from his forehead. "We know how the mountain works now, and I have a few ideas for some upgrades to the Peregrine's defense grid." He stood up and looked out over the valley. The lavender was still there, swaying in the breeze as if the battle had never happened. He felt a profound sense of pride, not just in his technical skill, but in the fact that they had stood their ground. They weren't just fugitives anymore. They were the masters of this world. Romy stepped close to him, her shoulder brushing his. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. The way she looked at the horizon with her chin held high and her eyes bright with the light of a free woman was all the thanks he needed. "We should go down," she said, her hand finding his. "Marnie will want to check your burns." Vance looked at his charred sleeves and laughed. It was a small price to pay for a home. He squeezed her hand, feeling the strength in her fingers and the warmth in her palm. They began the long walk back down the ridge, two souls who had survived the worst the galaxy could throw at them, heading toward a house that was finally starting to feel like a home. The stars were coming out, and for the first time in his life, Vance didn't look at them as a map for escape. He looked at them as a ceiling for the life they were going to build together. The morning light on Ethelgard did not arrive with a roar, but with a soft, amber glow that crept over the lavender fields. Vance sat on the lowered ramp of the Peregrine, his heavy industrial wrench resting across his knees. His hands were stained with carbon scoring and the shimmering dust of the crystals he had spent all night processing. He wiped a smudge of grease from his forehead and looked toward the cabin. Hollis walked down the ramp, carrying 2 mugs of recycled coffee. He handed one to Vance and sat on a nearby crate. The pilot looked tired, but his eyes were clear of the frantic worry that had defined the last several months. He gestured toward the horizon where the charred remains of the Aegis drop pods were still cooling. "They are truly gone," Holly said. "I ran a deep space sweep. No signatures within 5 light years. They scrambled back to the core systems like dogs with their tails between their legs." Vance took a slow sip of the bitter liquid. "They are gone for now, but Aegis has a long memory. That is why I stayed up. I finished the modification to the planetary relay." Hollis raised an eyebrow, the crystal resonance. Vance nodded. "I used the data I pulled from Commander Vane's interceptor before we sent him packing. I have synchronized the mountain's natural frequency with the ship's stealth drive. It creates a refraction field. To any long-range scanner, Ethelgard now looks like a radioactive wasteland with 0 life sign readings. We are invisible." Hollis let out a short, sharp laugh and slapped Vance on the shoulder. "You are a genius, kid. A greasy, tired genius. I guess that means we are actually staying." Vance looked at the cabin again. The door opened, and Romy stepped out. She was wearing the oversized flight jacket Vance had given her weeks ago. She didn't look like a weapon anymore. She looked like a woman who had finally found her footing on solid ground. "That was always the plan," Vance said quietly. Marnie appeared behind Romy, carrying a medical kit. She started walking toward the ramp, her expression as stern as ever, though there was a softness in her gait. She stopped in front of Vance and gestured for him to hold out his arm. "Let me see those burns from the ridge, Vance," Marnie commanded. "I told you to come to the med bay 3 hours ago." "It is just a bit of singed skin," Marnie, Vance replied, though he dutifully extended his arm. "It is a second-degree thermal injury," she countered, applying a cooling gel that smelled of mint and chemicals. "If you lose the use of your hands, who is going to keep this bucket of bolts flying? Hollies certainly cannot do it." Hollies took a mock-offended sip of his coffee. "I keep us in the air. Vance just keeps the air inside. It is a partnership." Romy reached the ramp and ignored the men, her focus entirely on the way Marnie was treating Vance. She knelt beside him, her blue and gold eyes tracking every movement of the medic's hands. She reached out and lightly touched the edge of the bandage Marnie was winding around Vance's forearm. "Does it still hurt?" Romy asked. Her voice was steady now, devoid of the jagged edge of pain that had haunted her since Void Station Delta. Vance looked at her and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun or the cooling gel. "Not anymore," he said. Marnie finished the bandage and packed her kit. "You two are lucky. If that feedback loop had been a fraction stronger, you would have been vaporized along with those Aegis sensors. Try to stay off the ridges for a few days." Marnie and Hollies headed back into the ship to begin the long process of converting the cargo hold into a more permanent storage area for their winter supplies. Vance and Romy were left alone in the quiet of the valley. Romy sat on the ramp next to him. She didn't stay inches away out of a programmed need for a handler anymore. She sat near him because she chose to. She looked out over the lavender, which swayed in a light breeze that carried the scent of rain and wild herbs. "I cannot hear them," Romy said softly. "The Aegis ships?" Vance asked. "No," she said, touching her temple. "The voices, the commands, the static that used to scream in the back of my head every time I breathed. It is just silence. It is the loudest thing I have ever heard." Vance set his coffee mug down and took her hand. His rough, calloused fingers fit perfectly against hers. "You are your own soul now, Romy. No one owns your thoughts. No one tells you where to stand or who to fight." She turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. "I want to stay here, Vance. I want to see what happens when the flowers change color. I want to build the fence you talked about. I want to know what it is like to wake up and not have to wonder if I will survive until noon." "We are going to do all of it," Vance promised. "Hollies is already planning an irrigation system for the North Field. Marnie is talking about scouting the local flora for medicinal properties. We aren't just surviving, we are living." Romy leaned her head against his shoulder. The weight of her was a comfort, a reminder of everything they had endured to get to this moment. From the collapsing corridors of the station to the cold vacuum of the nebula, they had been forged in the same fire. "Vance," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Yeah. Thank you for the wrench." Vance chuckled, remembering the heavy tool he had used to shatter her shackles. "It was the best use of a Grade 4 industrial spanner I ever found." They sat there for a long time as the sun climbed higher, turning the crystalline peaks into shards of brilliant white light. There were no sirens here. There were no corporate demands or the threat of the black market. There was only the steady beat of two hearts and the vast, open future of a world that didn't even have a name on the official maps. Vance stood up and offered his hand to her. "Come on. Hollies mentioned something about the moisture vaporizers acting up in the lower valley. If we are going to be farmers, we might as well be good ones." Romy stood, her strength fluid and effortless. She didn't follow him this time. She walked beside him, her shoulder brushing his as they headed toward the fields. The peregrine sat behind them, a silent sentinel of their past, but their eyes were fixed on the horizon. The galaxy was a massive, often cruel place, but in this small corner of the stars, they had carved out something real. Vance knew there would be challenges. He knew the machines would break and the seasons would be harsh. But as he looked at Romy, Seeing the peace in her dual-colored eyes, he knew he had everything he needed to fix whatever came their way. They reached the edge of the lavender, and for the first time in his life, Vance didn't feel like a man on the run. He felt like a man who had finally come home. He squeezed Romy's hand, and together they stepped into the tall purple grass, leaving the war and the shadows behind them forever.